Afternoon, everyone. Some introductions. My name is Charlie Skipworth Button. I am a director at BMS. I'm a political violence and terrorism broker. I set up the specialist team at BMS in February 2022. Prior to that, I was running the terrorism portfolio at IIZI for 7 years.
Hi, everybody. My name is Craig Curtis. I'm an underwriter on the reinsurance side in Lloyd's for Chaucer Syndicate. I've been doing political violence and crisis management for the last 14 years. So I've seen lots of interesting things happen over that time. And prior to that, I was involved within the property line of business and marine liabilities.
And lastly, I'm Tom Holmes. I'm a senior underwriter at Liberty, where I underwrite political violence risks. Been doing that for 6 years at Liberty. And prior to joining insurance, I was also in the British Army for 8 years.
Before we move on to the rest of the slides, I wanted to give you a brief background on the political violence market. We might refer it to as the PV market. Prior to 9/11, there was no specialist sort of PV space. There were no specialist brokers. Most of the terrorism in the world was underwritten in property policies. There was some some coverage for war, but like I said, there were no specialist terrorism brokers. Sadly, the event that was 9/11, really shone a light on the marketplace that we needed a specific, dedicated political violence market. Fast forward to where we are now. In Lloyd's of London alone, there are 30 or more syndicates that will offer political violence insurance. Globally, there are more international companies and insurance companies outside of that. It's been a really fascinating sort of 7 or 8 years for us. As I said, sort of post 9/11, actually, in terms of frequency of events, we actually didn't have that many losses in our market. We then went through a string of quite significant losses. So we had 2019, the Chilean riots, South African riots, 2021, Russia, Ukraine, and then Israel, Palestine. So our market continues to evolve, as the political landscape evolves. So it's been a really interesting space for us. I'll just pass over to Tom now for his...
Perfect, thanks. So today I'm going to be discussing and giving you a quick overview of the political violence events in the Baltic states, and then go on to discuss how I would, as a London underwriter, assess and review and price up these risks. So as you can see from this map, these are the events that have happened in the last 1 or 2 years. There's probably others, but these are the ones that have been proven to be linked back to the Russian state. And these are the events that have happened in the Baltic states. Unfortunately, this is not unique to the Baltic states. These events are happening all over Europe, from Poland, Germany, France, and UK, with probably Poland bearing the brunt of these attacks. But this slide does give you a good overview. We'll go into more detail on the type of events in the next slide. But as you can see, the anchor marks on the offshore risks, the red ones indicate telecommunication cables which have been cut. The yellow one signifies the electricity cable that's been cut, and the final one, the blue one at the top, signifies a gas pipeline which has been cut. And then the airspace incursions, they're denoted by their little aeroplane signs, and then the arson attacks and sabotage attacks, they're denoted by the flames. Now, the box on the right, this shows you the occupancy of these attacks and the quantum of them. And as you can see, there's a good spread of occupancies from telecommunications, public spaces, defense, and warehouses. So there is a good spread, but one thing which is the same is the type and method of attack. These attacks are carried out by low-level sophistication methods. These aren't being carried out by highly trained Russian agents. These are local proxies who have been paid a few $1,000s at a time to carry out these attacks. They're targeting companies and areas which have little to low security, and they're targeting the sort of easier assets. And likewise, on the offshore risks, the cables that are being cut, these are also being carried out by quite a low-level sophistication method known as anchor dragging. where ships passing through, just lowering their anchor, getting on the seabed floor, carry on going, and the anchor will just destroy everything in its path on the bottom floor. So low-level type attacks, they have been proven to be linked back to Russia, but they're carried out mostly by local proxies. So we'll just go on to the next slide. We can see in a bit more detail here. We'll start off on the right-hand side of the map, or on the page, sorry. This goes into a bit more detail about the offshore risks. The cables which have been cut, these have all been linked back to either Russian, Chinese, or Hong Kong flagged vessels that have been transiting and doing trade with Russia. These vessels will have been likely co-opted by the Russian state to drop their anchor at various points and destroy cables in their path en route to Russia to do trade. On the onshore side of risks, on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see the blue aeroplane signs. These are the airspace incursions. The ones on the coastal side, these are all being done by military fighter jets. And then there's two others. There's the one in the south of Estonia that was carried out by drones over a military airbase. And then in the south in Lithuania, that one airspace incursion was carried out by a weather balloon, which we saw this technique also used in, or by the Chinese across America a year or so ago, when their weather balloon pretty much flew over the whole of North America. So these are the events that have been happening. Our assessment is that these events are likely to continue happening until there's a resolution to the war in Ukraine, and it's the Russian state putting pressure on Western governments and European governments to stop their support for Ukraine and try and sow confusion and discontent amongst the European nations. So as a London underwriter, how would we assess risks that are coming to us? Well, firstly, we look at the ownership of the risks, whether it's Ukrainian-owned, local-owned, or US-owned, etc., who've got quite strong opposition. If you look a bit closer on the map, you'll see in Estonia the arson attack in the north, that was against a Ukrainian restaurant, and then the arson attack in the middle of Estonia, that was an arson attack on a Ukrainian vehicle with Ukrainian vehicle registration plates. So they are targeting specific nationalities. We'd also look at the location. Is it near a border? Is it near a sensitive site that could be attacked? And it might not be the intended target, but it might get caught up in an attack on another location. We'd want to assess what deductibles clients are willing to take. If it's got it's got physical damage and business interruption, are they willing to take a day deductible for the business interruption from 7 to 14 days would give us some level of comfort. And the sort of limit that the clients are purchasing in relation to their TIV. If it's a huge TIV, total insured values, and they're only purchasing a very small limit, obviously the rates will be inflated for that. Whereas if they're buying a fairly decent big limit in line with their total insured values, then the rates will be a lot lower. And then I'm going to hand back over to Charlie.
So we thought it'd be good to sort of discuss two case studies. First one on the left-hand side was a shopping centre arson loss in Poland, Warsaw, last year. The Polish authorities sort of originally deemed it as sort of Russian state intelligence was involved in the attack. I'm not quite sure how that was finalised now, but I believe it's been paid and settled under the main property programme. So in our eyes, it's sort of fallen outside of our political sphere. On the right-hand side, an event that happened in Estonia in August 2025. This was a suspected Ukrainian drone that was on its travelling to Russia. The jammers had jammed the signal, which had caused it to fly off path and landed in Estonia. Now, the interesting thing about that is that if that were to have landed on an industrial site or a residential building, that could cause some quite significant damage. And the 2 points of these case studies really is to highlight that actually, the loss scenarios are becoming more complex. And if you think of terrorism, people might think of the old-fashioned terrorism attacks, which are a car bomb assassinating a politician outside a hotel, or people think of war and civil war. But in reality, as per Tom's slides with the sabotage and the way that the political landscape is evolving, the type of loss scenarios are changing. So us as a marketplace, we're having to adapt our wordings, we're having to adapt our products and our solutions in order to provide solutions for incidents like this. But ultimately, it is quite complex, 2 quite interesting cases. Very hard for us to stand up here and say how they would fall, without having the full details behind it. But it's just a good way to highlight sort of Tom's details in practice on what's happening day to day.
With there being a lot of risk managers in the room, we thought it would be good to explain what, from an underwriter's perspective, is a good and a bad risk. When it comes to the factors that we look at, there are 5 main ones, really. First one being the country and the geopolitical environment. The asset type is very key, and we'll go into a bit more detail about that shortly. Physical security, risk assessment, and perhaps one that people don't think too much about is the corporate social responsibility and the culture. So from a country and a geopolitical environment perspective, what we class as a good risk, and when I say good, it could mean more high risk. Obviously, every risk can be underwritten. So what do we look at? We look at how stable the government is. So within our political violence sphere, we cover terrorism, strikes, riots, civil commotion, and then war. So from a stable government perspective, that's very much around the strikes, riots, civil commotion part of the business that we look at. And also stable in terms of are they going to upset their neighbours, other countries. A key factor, which is probably quite relevant, is how close are they to conflict zones. Given where we are in the world right now, and having Russia next door, that's obviously a key factor that we would look at. The international relations, again, I think pretty key right now with what's going on in the world is how close are they to their partners in terms of working with them, upsetting them. You just have to look at what's going on in Greenland right now, and that argument with the US and the European countries. And again, stable economic conditions, things like unemployment levels. These are all details which could cause a huge flare-up, and it's something that we saw in South Africa and in Chile that developed into huge losses for our market. The asset type is very key, and when I say, again, good risk, bad risk, this is high and low. So what we class as a high-risk asset type is clearly government buildings. Whenever there's an incident, it's generally something linked to the government, and therefore they attract a higher risk level. Critical infrastructure. So that's things like oil and gas, energy. And interestingly, when we look at Ukraine, Russia, we took losses in Ukraine during that period, and some interesting statistics came out of that, in that over 80% of the wind farms were taken down following the Russian attacks, and over 50% of the solar plants were taken down. That's a big number. And Estonia, everyone around the world is looking more at renewable energy. Look, if there's a war, what's the first thing they go for? They take out the power. So yeah, that's something that we look into. From a more terrorism perspective, strikes, riots, civil commotion, we look at the footfall, a city centre. Generally, when there's a protest, it will be around a main city centre focal point. And from a terrorism perspective, you're looking at Western-owned companies, especially when you look at where terrorism would come from. It's coming from the likes of ISIS. They obviously would target a Western-owned company more than they would a Chinese company. So in terms of physical security, I mean, it's pretty obvious. But one thing worth mentioning here actually is that given the trend of attacks that we've been seeing around drones, we're seeing a lot more drone attacks happen now than we would have done 5-10 years ago. Obviously, the main kind of physical security, so having security guards, CCTV, having access controls is great. But we have seen some clients now develop anti-drone technology and use it to very good effect. So again, depending on what it is, I'd say, especially around the oil and gas sector, if you've got anti-drone technology, that's a big tick from our perspective, because it means that you're forward-thinking and you're looking at the future risks, not just what's happened in the past. The corporate social responsibility, this really links back to the strikes, riots, and civil commotion part here. We see around the world a lot of losses coming from businesses who take a piece of land. The locals disagree with that, and then they protest and damage that property. So having good relations with the local community helps a lot. That could be employing local people as the workforce, and finally, with the staff, the unions. You know, if you've got a union, do you have a good relationship with that union? Are you having a backlash every year based on what your salary increases are? These are the sort of things that we're thinking of. And finally, risk assessment, which I guess is relevant for all lines of business. You know, do they have a tested crisis management plan? How good is their business continuity plan? Something that we look at is, especially around critical infrastructure, is you know, are they reliant purely on one asset? If it's a certain battery, do they have another battery stored somewhere off-site? So if something was to happen, they can quickly get back in, and it stops that long-term business interruption that we see. So yeah, that's what I would say we look at as underwriters when we assess a risk, and obviously that has a big impact on the pricing, the terms and conditions. So the more of this we can get hold of, the better it is. So in terms of how risk managers can mitigate war and terror risks, a lot of these I've mentioned. Using a geographic diversification of assets and suppliers. Again, if something was to happen, how quickly can you get something in to replace it? We saw in Ukraine, actually, when it came to, and we'll go on to coverages later, but what we call contingent business interruption. So reliance on suppliers, and the other way to customers. We saw a significant amount of losses coming from the contingent business interruption side. So if you've got reliance purely on one supplier, obviously that makes it more difficult if something was to happen there. If you've got multiple suppliers, obviously that makes it a lot easier for us. Again, similar, having separate critical functions across locations. Again, not relying on that one location, that if it goes down, we're in big trouble. Intelligence and threat monitoring. Some companies do this. It depends on where you are in the world as to how much you do this, but if we see a client taking this into account, it's like they're forward thinking, they're thinking about the risk. I want to work with you because you know what the risk is and you're taking action. Of course, focus on the physical security, and if you've got the anti-drone technology, even better. Having specific crisis management plans alongside we see some clients, they do the fire drills regularly. Some of our clients will do a crisis response. So if something happens, I don't know, someone comes in with a gun or a knife, how do you react to that? And it's something that we see more and more clients do. Again, local community engagement. Encourage that, of course, with the unions, and incident reporting. It just shows that the client is taking it seriously. And probably one of the most important things we see is that risk managers, clients say, "Oh, we don't have an issue. There's no threat. There's no nothing." And then all of a sudden something happens, and then they come to buy the coverage, and it's very expensive. So what I would say is perhaps be proactive. We're more likely to stick with a client if they've purchased for a longer period rather than jumping in and out. And we want to build relationships with those clients. So what I would say is explore the coverage. You might be surprised at how cheap it could be, especially when you're looking at some of your property premiums. But yeah, be proactive, not reactive, because as a market, it's supply and demand. You look at Ukraine, there was a huge amount of capacity before Russia attacked Ukraine. Now, very limited capacity, and it's very expensive. So I would say, yeah, as a risk manager, you probably want to look at this now rather than down the line following an event.
So here we just have a summary of the coverages that are available in our market. You'll see sort of riot, strike, civil commotion, terrorism, sabotage, malicious damage, insurrection, rebellion, mutiny, counterinsurgency, war, civil war. And as I said earlier, we've had to adapt our solutions and the available coverages because of the way the landscape is changing. So a good example of that is active assailant, active shooter. This effectively is for sort of less relevant, I guess, for this audience, but if you look at all the lone wolf attacks that you have in the US, particularly it's really awful, but the shootings that you have at schools. Now, a traditional terrorism policy would only respond if there's a political, ideological, or religious link to the attack. And quite often there's a teenager that doesn't like his classmates, right? So that doesn't fall into traditional terrorism policy. And our terrorism policies are geared up more to pay for physical damage and business interruption. So one of the new solutions that's been put together in the last 7 years is what we call an active shooter product. Now, instead of that having to be political, ideological, or religious, that is the trigger for that now is just a brandishing of a weapon with the intent to cause harm and mischief. So that's one way that we've had to adapt our coverages. Another interesting one is loss of attraction. So if you were to have an incident within a radius of an asset, sometimes they can be countrywide, and that incident was to cause a downturn in your business. Let's say you're in hospitality, you run a hotel and tourism is down for the next 2 years. That's something we can cover off the back of a terrorism event or a war or a civil war. Event cancellation as well, quite similar. Parametric terrorism is a newer product. I wouldn't say it's overly popular. Did either of you write it? There are some parametric terrorism coverages available. I would say it's sort of in its early years, and we're sort of trying to develop it to the point where we are now. Cyber terrorism is an interesting one as well, and NCBR, that stands for nuclear, chemical, biological, and radiological. Within the political violence sphere, we also do kidnap and ransom. I won't bore you entirely with all of these specific wordings, but this is there are 5 main core wordings that you'll see that we use in Lloyd's. So LMA 3030 essentially just covers sabotage and terrorism. LMA 3092 is S&T, so sabotage and terrorism, plus strikes, riots, and civil commotion. Beasley 1 to 7 and Hiscox 1 to 5 are what we call full PV. So that's the full spectrum of perils from sabotage and terrorism all the way through to war. LMA 5039 is just a business interruption extension. It's important to highlight that no client has to buy the full spectrum of PV perils. They can buy some parts of the world, different territories buy different products. For example, Latin America, they're only really interested in the strikes, riots, civil commotion, not interested in war or civil war. USA, for example, only buy sabotage and terrorism. They don't buy anything else. Southeast Asia, Africa, Middle East, very popular on buying full PV. One thing I would say is it's looking at the scale here. There can be a bit of ambiguity between what's a terrorist attack and what's a war event. Or what we try to advise is that if you want to remove any ambiguity with the perils and the definitions, you're best buying the full PV spectrum. That way we can ensure there are no gaps in coverage, and every eventuality should be covered under the full PV policy. I think that's all we have today. If there are any questions.
Yep, thank you. Definitely we have some questions, and one goes about insuring dual-use manufacturing companies. Can military and defense or dual-use manufacturing companies be insured against war and terrorism risks?
In short, yes, but it could be quite expensive, given the risk level involved. Yeah, we write these things around the world. Obviously, it becomes a bit more difficult, so you may struggle to get big limits, but for sure the market will offer that solution.
But in bigger picture, how has the international insurance market changed its view of Baltic risks here in Estonia in the last few years, and what events have most affected pricing and coverage?
I'll answer this one. The view of the Baltic states, I wouldn't say has dramatically changed. We didn't write a lot of coverage in the Baltic states, I wouldn't say, unless you say otherwise. We saw very little submissions. We saw lots in the rest of Europe, and we've lots of exposure in Europe, but none really in the Baltic states. The war, obviously, in Ukraine has changed it to some degree with air incursions coming over and a few arson attacks. But even though these events are happening, they are quite sporadic at the moment. And I wouldn't say our view is, or the Baltic States is extreme, and we'd be happy, and we'd want to offer this coverage in the Baltic States to you, your clients, etc. But in all, it hasn't dramatically worsened, I won't say.
Which war, terrorism, or political violence risks do companies most often think are insured, but in reality are not covered?
I think the political risks element. So we're very much a physical damage policy. So for there to be a loss, there has to be a physical damage loss. So where you might get a situation where a war happens, everybody leaves, and then they submit a claim, that's very much a political risk coverage. So forced abandonment, for example. So there's a little bit of, I think, education there for clients to understand that the difference between political risks and a political violence policy.
So, and last question again about Ukraine. If companies had been more proactive and insured their operations in Ukraine before the war, would that have been actually helped them? Or would they still have ended up without coverage once the war started?
I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the take-up of insurance in Ukraine was actually quite good. I think a lot of the companies are actually quite well protected. They bought quite large limits. Prior to Russia invading, there'd obviously been issues there, but in reality, the level of premium was actually quite low. So a lot of these companies, as Craig was mentioning earlier, the wind farms, they were buying big limits, $400 or $500 million of coverage. So actually the take-up was quite good. They were quite well protected. To your point about, when the war starts, that coverage is still in place. That coverage is still in place for the duration of their policy. So if they bought a policy for 12 months the day before Russia invaded, they would have that policy for the remainder of the 12 months. It's not, you might read sometimes in the news of aviation war, won't go down that rabbit hole, but that sits outside of our sphere. They have some particularly weird clauses in there that suggest that you can cancel a contract. Our policies are non-cancelable. So, if someone buys a 2-year policy in Estonia, that's live for 2 years, regardless of what happens in that time.
And it's also worth pointing out that, so myself at Liberty and Craig at Chaucer, we're still writing in Ukraine at the moment. So we're still quoting and binding risks. What probably has changed is the limits available to the clients.
Just put it into context as well, that the loss that we saw from Ukraine is multi-billion dollars, which the PV market has paid out. So we are paying losses, and that's, on top of Israel, had significantly large losses as well. South Africa, multi-billion dollar losses. Chile, multi-billion dollar losses. So the market the product works, and we do, we pay when there's when clients are in distress.
Charlie, Craig, Tom, thank you for being with us today, and thanks for your presentation.
Thank you.